Hello, everyone. Thanks again for coming to this webinar. Today we have Tiffany MacDonald with us. She is Manager of Academic Studies at East Coast School of Languages in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She kindly agreed to do a webinar for us on one of her passions, the malleability of language and context and creativity in the classroom. Tiffany is a certified CELTA teacher. She has experience teaching in Canada and abroad, but on top of all that, she is also excited by traveling and reading and writing. I think she is a great speaker and a great presenter, and I hope you enjoy this session. Please join me in welcoming Tiffany.
Thank you so much. That's a very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. Nice.
Okay, here you go, Tiffany.
Thank you very much. Oh, so now I have control. Sorry, I'm learning as I go, everybody. Okay. Sorry, I'll just have to go back to the beginning here. All right, so welcome everyone. I'm very happy to see all of you here this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in Canada or abroad. So as Juliana very generously introduced me, I'm currently working as the Manager of Academic Services at East Coast School of Languages in Halifax. And so today I want to talk to you a little bit about language and how, because of the ever-changing nature of language, while many people are maybe daunted or threatened by this, it's a very exciting tool that we can use as instructors of the English language. And that when we look at context and see how important context is in the way that we teach our students and the way that they learn language, that we can use that to encourage our learners to be more creative with language and enjoy it and be passionate about it. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Okay. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about me, though Juliana has covered most of that. So before I became an instructor, I actually majored in creative writing and English in my undergraduate degree. And so that's where my passion really started for language and writing and clear communication. And I've been working in ELT for over 10 years now. I first started as a teacher, of course, and I've worked as an administrator, program administrator, manager, and an advisor for the last, since I've been in this role, which has been 6 years. And one of my passions is editing. That's something that I do in my free time, but I bring it into my work as well. And through editing and studying different courses in editing, I've really developed an interest in a much more descriptivist approach to language, and in seeing that the exciting way that languages evolve and through my experience in editing. I'll also be the editor of TESOL Nova Scotia in 2015, so I'm very excited to take that on. So all of these things combined with my personal interest in sociolinguistics, all of this kind of affects the presentation that I'm giving today and the approach that I take to instruction, to language instruction. So thanks for listening to my blurb about myself. So basically what I'd like you to do now is actually to take a look at this little short passage, these couple of sentences here. So what I'd like you to do is think about, as an instructor, if you looked at this section of text, would you make any suggestions or changes to a learner who wrote this text? So if you could take a minute and read it and maybe write down a few things in the comments that you might change in these couple of sentences. Okay, so I'll give you about a minute to take a look at that. Okay. Okay, interesting. good. Guys, anybody else have any ideas? Yes, Adam, we could say probably creative writing or just personal writing here, based on the tone of the writing. That's an excellent question, Adam. Since context is everything. Okay. All right. Yeah, very good. Okay, so we've got a couple of different answers here. Good. Excellent, Deborah. That's a good thing to pick up on. Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to take too much time on this. So if you've got any other ideas, you can keep them in your mind. Yes, very good. I agree, Mahmoud. So if we look at these sentences, right? Aha, good. You guys are making my points before I can even make them, which is excellent. Basically, if we look at these couple of sentences, right, some people might have some different changes they would make to it. For example, I'm very interested in Anonymous, in your suggestions about commas after at parties and after weekends. And of course, I'm really excited that Deborah's brought up hopefully as a sentence adverb. But really, I agree with most of you in that, are there any necessary changes to make in this passage? Well, my answer would be no. And so a lot of the things that I'm just going to go back so that you can have a look. A lot of the things that we might correct, or some people might correct in these sentences. So for example, the split infinitive, which is kind of a little bit of a joke to be thrown in there. Or the non-restrictive which as a relative pronoun in a non-restrictive adjective clause, hopefully as a sentence adverb, which thank you for raising that, Deborah. And also the commas after at parties and at weekends. The first couple are, as I would say, these are vestigial rules. I'm going to use my air quotation marks here. And I did a little nod to Strunk and White there because there, hopefully as a sentence adverb, they really railed on that. And a lot of instructors sometimes have a tendency to pass on these kinds of, oh, you really shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do this in this kind of tone or in this style of writing. I should also mention and to begin a sentence, which a lot of instructors might correct in a student's writing. But these are actually either rules that are no longer rules, or that language patterns that were once enforced, say 10, 15 years ago, that are no longer rules, especially given the context here of a more relaxed style of writing. And we also have the at parties comma and the at weekends comma, which were mentioned. These are actually stylistic preferences. And that's something I'm going to talk a little bit about today, because style is extremely important when you're looking at context in communication. And so it's important to note that that is actually a choice that you can make depending on the context that you're writing in. And I would not correct that if a student wrote that. I might point it out in certain circumstances, but I would never correct it or take off points for it. Okay. And at weekends, as Deborah mentioned, is a British construction, where we might point out in a Canadian context that at weekends, on weekends is usually how we phrase it in Canada. But again, it's not an error. It's just a regionalism, a regional difference. Okay. So knowing all of these things is really empowering, both as an instructor and as a learner. And for your learners to know this stuff, to know all these different patterns of language and contextual issues is actually really, really advantageous for them, because they learn how to be creative with language and how to change language depending on the context. And your knowledge of this kind of information is really helpful for you as an instructor to pass it on to your students. So that's kind of where I'm going today. So I'm going to talk a little bit after that introduction about my rationale behind this idea of language as a malleable learning tool. And I'll give you guys a couple of activities that you can actually use in the classroom. Yes, I'm Mahmoud. Sorry, I agree with you completely. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit in the presentation about the difference between academic and media and other different contexts as well. Actually, I'll give you an example of an activity that you can use later on for that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about evaluating learners, because this is something that connects to this idea of context and the role of context within teaching language, and how you evaluate students is a very important component. And then we'll just talk a little bit about a couple of conclusions. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. Do you have any more questions there? And please, anytime you want to pose a question or make a comment in the chat, please feel free. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my rationale behind this, and this is where, for me, it's something that I'm really passionate about. If you look at globally how many different forms of English there are, it's remarkable. And using that is such a key component of what we do as instructors, and being able to tap into that and using it as a tool, because I think it's really daunting for not only for instructors but also for learners when they look at how much English and other languages also can change depending on the context. But it's remarkable how context changes things, and this is something you guys are commenting on, which is really great. So some of the things that I want to talk about a little bit are how, you know, your context changes everything from the style that you use in writing, grammar and syntax that you use. You know, for instance, if you are looking at the subjunctive mood and you're in Britain, you're going to have to teach that differently than you would here in Canada, because we use them differently. And so the way that we actually have patterns of grammar and syntax in language, those change completely depending on where you are or what context you're in. Register, of course, that's very clear, depending on if you're writing an academic passage or you're writing an email to a friend, not just the grammar, syntax, and style that you use, but also the actual vocabulary you choose will be very different. Context affects things like dialects and regionalisms, but of course, you're looking at the way that the language is going to change drastically from one to the other. And diglossia is a really interesting area for me as well. I would use Arabic, of course, as an example, and the way that Arabic is used when you're talking about the differences between, say, Arabic used in Algeria compared to Saudi Arabia, where they can, barely communicate verbally with the standard or the Arabic used regionally, but that they can use Fossa, the high form of Arabic, to be able to communicate, especially in writing. So these kinds of things really are affected by context. And in the next slide, I'm going to give a couple of really specific examples just to illustrate this. So really what I'm really excited about when I look at this is that, as I've mentioned already, that this is fascinating, and that if you can tap into that fascination in your classes and really excite your learners and make them, and you be passionate about it and pass that passion on to your students so that they can see it as something that's really interesting and exciting, and then they're going to use that as a learning opportunity and become more aware of the way that English blends with their languages, the way that their languages actually function. Learning all of this stuff is absolutely fascinating, and so if you can really pass that on to your students, then it will be a great tool for you to use in the classroom. I don't want you to think that especially I know anybody who knows me would be shocked to people tend to think that because I love talking about patterns of language and I love talking about grammar and I'm interested in editing. So I think that it's very important to be able to teach and recognize patterns of language. And I've used the term rules here, but even rules, I don't know if I'm a big fan of the word rules. I really like patterns, because rules suggest that this is what you do, and if you do it incorrectly, you're breaking rules. Well, rules are made to be broken. So it's more patterns, and trying to use language clearly and perhaps even correctly. This is important, but I think that if you are aware of the fact that these things change constantly, and that you're on it, you are keeping abreast of any changes that are happening with the language, and you can find that passion in yourself, and then you're using and passing that on to your students, it's really a remarkable thing. So everyone will win from that. Okay. I wanted to give a couple of examples of context, and just to illustrate, as in my previous slide, the things like grammar, syntax, register, diglossia, and things of that nature. Just a couple to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So we've already touched on comma style. So this is something that I'm glad came up. So the way that you use commas is completely different from one context to the next. So and this is really interesting and exciting. And if your learners are aware of this, then they're going to be empowered to actually play with punctuation, to use it as a tool. It's like a key that opens up a lock to be able to express things. And sometimes I think a lot of instructors, language instructors, are daunted by teaching punctuation because it seems complex, but really understanding context is everything with punctuation. And when you can carry that over and pass that on to your students, it's really exciting. So my example would be comma style in academic writing. So styles like APA or Chicago, they tend to use commas quite liberally. So you'll see commas after introductory phrases. You'll see Oxford comma or series commas being used. In these types of styles of writing, clarity is one of the biggest aims. So they tend to use commas because then you know for sure that the sentence will be easier to parse for the reader. However, in print media or media writing, the style, like Canadian press style, for example, the style is very minimal with punctuation because they're working with things like word counts and space limitations. So they have to really be minimal. So if you have a shorter introductory phrase, for example, that's say fewer than 4 words, they're not going to use a comma, or they're not going to use the Oxford comma unless it's absolutely necessary to avoid some kind of confusion. So if you pass this kind of thing on to your students, and I'll talk about an activity that you can do to do that, this is really empowering for them because they do work within different contexts of writing, from creative writing to academic writing, depending on the needs of your learners. So instructing your students in this is really key. A couple of other things I've just mentioned, I'll go over really briefly. I'm really interested in the Arabic chat alphabet. I'm sure some of you guys have either used or have seen this, where a lot of Arabic speakers and writers will, when they're chatting online, they tend to use this interesting combination of Latin letters and Roman numerals, or Arabic numerals actually. And it's really an interesting case to look at things like this and actually talk about them in your classes, because this evolved from technology, and technology is such an important aspect of language and the way that language is evolving now, and it's changing in so many ways if you can look at the role of technology. So the basic history here was, of course, that this alphabet developed when the internet became, a bigger thing, and users in Arabic speaking and writing countries were using keyboards that didn't have Arabic letters on them, or that it was too complex to have on a keyboard. So this evolved from that, and that also has connections with English. And so if you can get your learners to explore things like this, it's really exciting to see how context can affect language. I've mentioned a couple of other things like Canadian American British spelling. I also mentioned Singlish and Standard English in Singapore, but I think in order to save some time, I won't get into that too much. But these are just examples of how a rich context can really alter the way that languages evolve, and so encouraging your students to look at that can be really, really enjoyable experience. Okay, so now that I've covered the rationale behind everything, I'd like to jump into one idea that I have for how to use this in the classroom, and this is using code switching. I'm guessing that most of you are probably familiar with the concept of code switching, but in the event that you aren't, code switching is the practice of alternating spontaneously between 2 or more languages, dialects, or accents. I even use code switching when referring to being able to switch between, like in cases of diglossia, where you have a higher form and a lower form of a language, or like, if you're using slang on, in regular conversation compared to being able to switch to a more formal form of language. So how I see this as a tool to explore context in the classroom. And this is something that's quite common. A lot of our learners do actually do code switching. In fact, I would say most of them do, especially if they are coming into a Canadian context from abroad. As they're here and they learn English or French, of course, more and more, they tend to take their language or languages from home and blend them together with English. So this is a really exciting tool that you can use in the classroom. So have an idea for an activity that you can use in order to put this into practice in your classroom. I will say that this works a little bit better with higher level students because building this kind of awareness, definitely, they can do more of an analysis, in-depth analysis at higher levels, but it's not to say that you can't do it at lower levels with students. So what you can do is you can get students to record a conversation if they're comfortable doing that. And if they're not comfortable doing that, the alternative, as you can see on my slide lower down, is they can actually take a text conversation, so an instant message or texting conversation. And I'm talking about a shorter conversation because longer you might get a little bogged down. But so what they can do in this case is they can actually listen to it and attempt to transcribe it if possible. It's not always possible, of course, because we have some languages that are just spoken. They don't actually have an alphabet. Or in some cases, your learners they might be at a literacy level and they're not able to do that. But if your learners are at that kind of level, they can transcribe the conversation, and they can do so in their own alphabet. Or if you're lucky and your learners have a version of it in Latin alphabet, then you say, for example, Pinyin, then you can do that as well. You can play around with it depending on your learners and your aims for the activity. So what you want your students to do in this case is to actually look at the conversation and look for any English words that were used, any English structures or structures in their own language that have come from English, if they are able to recognize that, any translations that they used, or in any ways that they can track an influence of English on that particular conversation. So, as I said, this works a little bit better with higher level students, obviously, but it's a really neat way to get them to look at it. So what you want them to do then is to take the conversation and then look at any of those uses of English, and then perhaps present those or discuss them together with the class. So the challenge here, of course, is if you're working with multicultural, multilingual learners who may not speak the original language, but that's okay, because really what they're focusing on is not they're focusing on the way that English is blended into the conversation. And I'm going to show you guys an example in a minute. So some of the advantages of this, and I know Juliana is going to talk about corpora and the importance of corpora. So what's really wonderful, thank you. What's really wonderful about this is that they're using real text that they actually generated themselves. So this is a really exciting way to use language well. That they have actually created themselves. And it's real language that they can actually relate to within their own context, which is really a great way for them to examine the context in which they are using language themselves. This kind of activity encourages language awareness in a different sort of way. So instead of, taking English sentences and really analyzing the structure of the sentence, they're doing it in a less kind of traditional classroom teacher presents and the students listen to that presentation, turning that model on its head and making the students, through their own exploration, become more aware of the way that languages are put together, the way that they blend. And this is also really great because the students are going to become more aware of how context affects the language. And again, it'll be clear when you look at the example that I have. And of course, makes for a more learner-centered approach, because the students are driving this entire activity, everything from start to finish. They create the text, they provide the analysis, and you're there merely as a facilitator. You can prompt them in order to maybe make the analysis a little bit more in depth, but you're able to do that. And I completely agree with Judy. We could do this with, it would be really interesting actually to do this with a class full of English language learners as well, because our language is this fantastic, combination of all kinds of other languages. So it's really, really fascinating to this. Okay. Before I show you the example, I have a couple of extra notes just to hints to make this work better. It's really, really important, I think. I know that a lot of us are working in contexts where, I know I work in a private language institute where there's an English-only policy. So you might be afraid to have other languages being explored in the classroom, but I really think it's important to not ban this kind of activity in the classroom where it's a controlled environment, because you're not using that language. They're not just speaking in their own languages in the classroom. They're using it as a tool to build language awareness and become more interested in English by using the their own way of using English and that type of thing. And you're encouraging them to be creative with it. So it's very important in order to encourage your learners to be creative and be playful with language in order to use it as a tool and to see it that way. Because that's what it is. Everybody around the world is using, as you said very well, that, globalization is, is having a massive impact, and English is remarkable, the role of English in this whole process. So getting your students to explore that is fantastic. So I'm just very briefly going to show you guys an example. I won't go into too much detail. You can check it out in your once you're through with it and you'd like to check out the materials. But I'm just going to show you this example. So let me see. I hope you guys can all see that well. So what I have here is a conversation between a Moroccan Arabic speaker whose second language is French and a Canadian English speaker who also speaks Acadian French, high intermediate to low advanced level. So if you look at this conversation very quickly, so this is a transcription of it. This is actually a text conversation that the Moroccan learner provided. So you see things like, hey, j'ai trouvé le keyboard français. You don't need to speak French for this, but you'll notice the word keyboard. And then you'll see things in this conversation like, je suis confiant que. Pretty lady is one of the, oh, sorry, I will make that bigger for you. Just 1 second. Here we go. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of an issue with how to do this, which I learned how to do before. Okay, well, I'm not sure. Oh, here we go.
Here you go.
Sorry, I put it out there. Sorry, guys, I forgot how to, okay, there we go. Is that big enough, everybody? Can you see it? Okay, good. So as I said, you don't need to speak French for this to work, but we've got expressions like keyboard right here. And I've also got je vais dormir, pretty lady, down here. Je te texte demain, down here. Yeah, and we've got sweet dreams here. Okay. Yes, Mahmoud, sorry, that's a very good point. In doing this kind of thing, it is very difficult to do with literacy learners. I think that competency is an important part, but I think that you can start building these types of things from an early level. So instead of teaching language very simply and saying this is the way that it is, I think that you start introducing these kinds of things really early on, slowly and very slowly, and building up to this kind of activity. Okay, so I'll just jump back in on this. So basically, some of the things that came up from this this activity from the Moroccan learner, he commented that if you look at the example of pretty lady in the middle of the conversation, he stated that as a Moroccan Arabic speaker in Canada, he tends to use terms of endearment in English, even though he speaks French, because he talked about how these kinds of terms of endearment in Morocco, they tend to use the ones that they use in Moroccan Arabic, and that the French terms of endearment change depending on the area, where if you were in Morocco or if you were using standard French or French here, they're all completely different. So he found that learning these kinds of things in the Canadian context, learning them in English and using them in English, even though he might be speaking French, avoids any kind of confusion. And he said he was really interested in learning this kind of language, that the more that he learns, it really helps him. So if he's really interested in learning this kind of language, obviously, because that's going to help him in the Canadian context. But the fact that he's using that, blending that with his French, even with a speaker who understands French, I think is very interesting. And he thought it was very interesting. And he was quite excited about learning this kind of language and saying that, that was helpful for him. And so he's also learning expressions and collocations through this interest. Another interesting thing to note with this example, and that's all I'll touch on for this today, if you want to take a look at the notes later, you can, is the use of text, je te texte demain, or j'ai trouvé le keyboard français. So one of the things that this learner commented on is that he said that even in Arabic, sometimes they use, in Moroccan Arabic, but also in French, when they're using these more kind of technological terms, they tend to sometimes use them in English, which is very interesting because English was sort of the first language of the internet. But it's really neat to see that that kind of language transfers to other languages and is borrowed. And the student commented on this himself. So I think that's really interesting. So that's all we'll talk about today. There's some interesting little tidbits about Acadian French there as well, but you can have a look at that in your free time. Okay, so just going to pull up my slides again here. Sorry. Oops, and I did the wrong one. Sorry about that. Okay. So I'm going to move on from code switching to style, and that's something that I touched on a lot at the beginning of the webinar. So style, I think, is something that we really, really need to keep in mind when we are instructing students, because I would say 80% of the supposed rules of language are actually stylistic preferences. Perhaps 80 is generous, but a lot of the things that are usually taught as rules are actually not really rules. So it's important to note that students need to be aware of this. And I think they need to be made aware of it as soon as possible in their learning. So style, of course, is the way that you write or the way that you speak. And really what this does is, as a writer or speaker, you're making certain choices about the way that you want your language to look, sound, and feel. And the more awareness that you have, and I agree with I do believe that, I can't remember who said it earlier in the conversation, but the idea that, context is very important for making these kinds of choices. So basically, yes, Adam, that's correct. This is indeed, style is a huge part of the writer's voice, but it's not just the writer's voice, it's also the speaker's voice. So it's important to note that this is applicable not only in writing, very, very much so in writing, because we have a lot more writing. Of course, we don't have the same pauses and the same use of gesture that we have in a speaking context. But style is very much so the choices that you make in order to communicate a message. And so the more awareness our learners have of what tools they have at their disposal in terms of style, the better communicators they will be. They need that proficiency too in their first language. I realize that language awareness is important, but that you can really work on building this in an English language learning context. Oops. So what we want to do too is to make students aware of the fact that often they're coming, especially students who come from, they have an academic background in language learning, they have this tendency to have learned everything as a set of rules, right? So they've learned, this is the rules, this is the way that the language is. And our job is to undo that and to tell them, guess what? All of those things that you learned were rules that were set that weren't changing. Yeah, that's not how language works. This is exciting. We want them to jump on board with this. We want them to be excited by it and not be scared, because their first instinct is to be scared, right? If you've just learned that everything you've been taught is a lie, essentially, it's a pretty traumatic experience for them. So if we can set the tone by making it exciting for them, then we're going to really make a difference in their learning process. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to just give you a couple of examples. There are millions of examples. These are mostly related to writing, but there are lots of other stylistic choices that you make when you speak, and those are typically more related to grammar and syntax and word choice. But in writing, some examples would be the series comma, capitalization choices. So there's something called up style and down style in capitalization, where if you want a more minimalistic approach, then you're going to take down style, which is just capitalizing what needs to be capitalized, where up style is actually more preferred in, let's say, a business context, where I don't know if you guys have seen business writing before, but they tend to sprinkle capital letters like salt and pepper to stress that something's important. And so that's not incorrect per se. It's just, it depends on the context in which you are writing. Quotation style, I'm sure that many of you are aware, I can tell by some of the comments here, that regional differences will have a big impact on this. British style and North American style of using quotation marks is completely different. We have the British logical style versus the North American style, and so being aware of this is actually really useful for learners who may be working in different contexts. We already talked a little bit about which as a non-restrictive adjective clauses and whether or not you can or can't use that. And I've got hyphenation of compounds here. This is every editor's worst nightmare because the way that compounds are either closed or open or hyphenated is completely different depending on where you are, what dictionary you're using, things like that. So that's important to note as well. Number style, do you spell it out or do you use the numeral under 10, under 100? Ad infinitum, as I've said here. There are so many different things that you can look at for style, and the list goes on and on. Okay. So I've got a couple of activity ideas here that I'm going to whiz through. One of them is something that we've already talked about, and that is to choose two texts. So again, we're touching on this idea of corpora. We're on using real, authentic texts. Okay. And yeah, sorry. So what you want to do in this case is to take, let's say, for example, you've got a journal article and a newspaper article. So we've already talked about commas after introductory phrases, right? So if you're teaching that particular point to your students, they can take a look at those two paragraphs and then make a note of any examples of that language point, whether it's there or it's not there. So for example, they would go through and look for commas after introductory phrases. So what you're doing there is you're actually teaching language awareness because the students are trying to parse and identify introductory phrases. So they're actually analyzing language in that case. But then they're also looking at the two different examples, right? The two different styles. And they're going to look at, okay, so this one does use them and this one doesn't use them. Why might that be the case? So getting your learners to explore that, to understand the reasons why it might be that way, and to actually also talk about the effect that that has on them as a reader. So how does it feel? How does it read? Can they read? Reading it out loud, if your students, I know some people agree and disagree with reading out loud, but if you're looking at something like punctuation, reading aloud is indeed a very good tool for them, especially at higher levels. Obviously at lower levels, if they don't have the skills to do that, it's more challenging. However, it is a really good tool to use if your learners have the ability to do so, because they can hear how it sounds different, the rhythm is different, and what impact that has on the reader. Okay, good. So that's one example. Another example, and this is something that I've done in previous classes, is to take something that people might see as an error and explore it. Okay, so one example that I'm going to talk about for this is the use of quotation marks, because we've discussed this already. And so not only in a writing context do we use quotation marks to identify direct speech. There are two other uses that you see primarily in English. One of them is irony. So, I'm a good presenter. And the other example would be one that is viewed by many as being a mistake, which is to use it for emphasis. Okay, so if you want to stress a word in a sign or on a menu or something like that, you see the use of quotation marks. And in here, of course, I have illustrated the ironic use with my errors. So in this kind of context, it's really useful to get students to look at this. It serves a lot of purposes. One of those is so that they can actually see that using language is something that everybody makes supposed mistakes. Native speakers of the language, non-native speakers, it doesn't matter, everyone makes mistakes. Though, as I said, I'm using errors and quotation marks here. So they're going to look at these kinds of examples and look at the way that it's used and look at the effect that it has on them, and does it affect the clarity of communication? Because that's one of the big aims here is, are we communicating clearly? That's really huge. So students can either correct those errors or they can try to replicate them, which is another thing that I found that works very interestingly, because the students are demonstrating that they actually understand that function or use of the particular language point that you're looking at. So one of the things that I've done in my classes, this is just an example of the emphasis quotation marks, which again can be very hilarious if it's not understood if you're talking about emphasis or irony. So you're looking at your chicken pot pies. So what's in that pot pie? So getting students to actually, I've actually gotten students to make their own examples of this. So, and putting them up on the walls and leaving them in the classroom. And so it's been, which was actually wildly successful, but it's getting them to play with that language, and they understand that this can be something that can cause miscommunication. So they're seeing and understanding that kind of miscommunication, and seeing that punctuation in this case is a tool for clear communication. And so they also understand this kind of common usage of a language point that they might see in real life and go, well, why are they using quotation marks there? That means, who are they quoting, right? So I think doing things like this is really, really important. Okay. I've got to go a little bit quickly here because I've only got a couple minutes left. So the advantages to this, the students in these contexts are learning to use language differently depending on the situation. They're understanding that these are actually tools to communicate clearly. Style is a tool. They're able to understand language more deeply and get a better understanding of the way that we use different things in English. And as I've said before, it's essentially a kind of code switching to be able to change depending on the context. And of course, for style, if they're learning stylistic preferences, they actually have to learn how to follow directions, which is something that is incredibly useful for students of another language. Students of English as an additional language. Okay, so I have a couple of extra suggestions for this. One thing that I learned in my experiences in editing is the importance of having a style guide. So one thing that you can do at your institution is actually come up with a style guide that your institution prefers, or select one. So you can choose, Chicago style or whatnot, which is a pretty popular one in North America. And why this is useful is because you're going to make choices about style within your institution, but then you want to pass that on both to your staff and your learners so that and you're going to teach them this right from the beginning. We like to put that comma after an introductory phrase. Why? Because we feel like it's easier and clearer for the reader to understand it. So benefits of this, of course, are getting your learners to understand style right from the beginning. Having a consistent style within your institution is also going to make your institutional communications clear as well. So anything that you're putting out into the world has a style that everyone is following, which is really, really useful for your institution as well as for your learners, because it's a learning tool for them. And so what's also really good about this too is when you pass that on to your students right from the beginning, you're not going to correct them. You're not going to say, oh, no, you have to follow our house style. You're just going to point it out to them and say, hey, here you could use this comma. It's not incorrect not to, but we like it at the school. So again, it's a way of teaching them that context changes the language. It's also, important for you to actually know the style and for all of your staff members to get them on board so that everybody's using that consistently. And then it's, again, encouraging them to experiment with it as well. It's very important. And so that they can understand that, understanding style is like a code so that they can be able to communicate or convey their message clearly. Okay. I got to go really fast because I have a minute. So, okay. Yes, I agree, Mahmoud, completely. Consistency is key, and it is an incredibly important aspect of your internal communications as well, so it has fringe benefits. So when you're looking at evaluating students, I think that what is very important is to reward clarity and creativity, because those are our aims ultimately. When students are exploring context, you want to reward them for this. You want to reward them for playing around with it, for being creative, and very important not to correct every supposed mistake. Again, keeping all the things in mind that we've talked about. When you're really looking at language and you're saying, okay, this is not clear. What you're trying to say is not clear, so we need to make it clearer. You're focusing on things that impede clear communication. You're not focusing on, this is very common, I know, in error correction when we're talking in the ELT industry in general. Don't correct every mistake, because then you have a page full of pen and it's daunting, and it doesn't encourage creativity at all for your students. And as I've said already, you're going to point out diversions from house style, but you're not going to correct them. You're not going to take off marks for that. You're just going to point it out to the students or the learners and the staff members as well, though that you might have to correct. If you're in a role like mine where you have to correct edit all the grammar that is put out, or the writing that is put out by your institution. Getting learners to reflect on the influence that their first or other languages have on their writing and speaking. And I don't see it necessarily as L1 interference. This term to me is a little bit outdated. I mean, it is interference in a sense when it does impede clarity, but I see it more as an influence thing, where if they can actually explore that and not see it as something that is impeding communication, but as something that is actually enabling them to communicate well, then that's really, really useful and important. Thanks, Juliana, for the reminder there. Because then it's going to enable them to build awareness of it and see it as a tool, again, as I've stated multiple times. So, in conclusion, I think that one of the most important things that I'd like to take from this, I feel that a lot of instructors that I've spoken to have a tendency to underestimate a little bit the learner's capacity, and that's why they simplify things, especially at the lower levels. They think that our learners can't really understand contextual differences and changes depending on the context. And I think that that's hogwash, frankly. I think that they do have the ability to absorb context. It's just the way that you present it, the way that you stage it for them. So you build it up as they're going and learning more and more. So getting them to reflect on that as early as possible is actually a tool rather than something that is to be viewed as I have to keep this simple for my learners. So, and really, the biggest thing that I can say from all of this is if you have the interest as an instructor, you have the passion for learning about changes in language, for learning about contextual differences, learning about style, and seeing language as a tool yourself, if you have that passion and curiosity, that's going to be contagious. Your learners will be absolutely engaged and focused and will be creative in that whole process. And that is half the battle. I mean, if you can do that, then you're good. You will have learners who are engaged and who are going to learn about the way that the language works. Okay. So if you have any questions, I whizzed through the end there a little bit. I really appreciate all of your great comments throughout the presentation, and very excited to see any questions that you may have for me or for each other. Yes, I've got a little picture of the Elements of Style by Strunk and White with a bunch of pens and pencils through it. My whole idea is down with prescriptivism, essentially. We can't view language as something that is this staunch, stoic, untouchable thing. We want to be playful with it. So thanks, guys. And thanks, Natalia. All right, so if you've got any questions. Oh, thank you, Judy. If you've got any questions, you can go ahead and type them in. No problem. It's my pleasure. It's fun. Fun is good. I'm glad that you felt that it was fun. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. I won't keep you any longer. I know you have to go. I just want to mention that I've been following Tiffany, I think, since the beginning of this year, and I'm so glad that this session happened today. Thank you so much.
No problem. It's my pleasure.
Oh, we have one.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, guys. Awesome. How could language interference impede? Okay. So, Mahmoud, when you say how could language interference impede conveying a well-informed message? So you mean like, for example, interference from a first language or second language interfering with a well-informed message. I would think, for example, in a case where a direct translation of an idiom is happening. This is something I see a lot with learners in our school. If you try to translate an idiom directly from one language to another, your message is probably going to be completely lost because of the nature of idiomatic language. But I think that in encouraging this kind of contextual approach and encouraging students to actually discuss the context in which they would use that idiom or body language or anything of that nature. I'm thinking about a student, and using code switching. Okay. Well, this is I could use the idiomatic example because this is something that happens. In the example that I provided you with, there's an example of something called an anglicism, or in French it's referred to as anglicisme. And this is where someone typically who either lives within a very French and English context, or someone who spoke English first and then learned French as an additional language. When code switching, they tend to use, yeah, exactly, franglais. Or if you're familiar with Acadian French, when you have chiac or like other versions of Acadian French where English and French are blended seamlessly, it's very interesting. But the example that I have in the activity that I provided is one where a student has an anglicism. So it's a direct translation of English into French. So it's not actually using English words in French. It's translating an expression the way, like a collocation in English into French using French vocabulary. And this is also, I mean, it's not just used in French, but I'm just using the French example because this is the one that I had in my activity. So that can actually can impede a well-informed message, as you've said, where the intent is there, but because the person using that language isn't using the expression correctly, it may or may not be clear, especially if the recipient of that message, yeah, that's a perfect example. The recipient may not be familiar with, in this case, English, right? So luckily in this case, the learner, the Moroccan speaker, was familiar with Acadian French and familiar with English. But somebody who spoke exclusively French or didn't speak any English whatsoever could be potentially confused by that construction. So I'd say that would be one example of that. Yeah. Yeah, that's true, Doreen. You're absolutely correct that some can be translated directly. But what I see most often around here is definitely translations of idioms or even body language where the communication of that is not necessarily clear until context is provided. Well, we say this. One example recently was a student in one class to another student who spoke the same language went like this in class, two Saudi Arabian students, without the context. And of course, everyone asked about it. And that gesture in Saudi Arabia means I've got your back. I support you. I'll do what you need me to do as your friend, which in encouraging a discussion of that in the classroom, a lot really came out of the discussion. Oh, okay. In English, we'd say, I have your back. What does it mean to use the word back in English? And what are some of the ways we use it? We use it as a verb. We use it as a noun. So again, rich context in understanding those types of things can be really useful. I hope that I answered your question, Mahmoud. That's a great question. Okay. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for participating, and I really your input and your questions and everything were valuable. So gave me some food for thought too. Yeah. Thank you.